big question people have? Like, what's the thing everybody's wondering about? What's the thing I don't understand? What would I want to hear?
It's like, that's Big Darklighter's home. So how did you know? Because I'm a nerd.
Cassie and Jim on the beach, and people are like, no. I can literally hear people out there, no.
Because Darth Vader was the scariest thing that had ever happened to anybody, and this guy literally looks like the devil.
What are you doing, C-3PO? I'm taking one last look at my friends. These aren't your friends.
And I get a later call that said, yeah, you probably want to use Wedge Antilles.
That spirit of doing everything they can to tell the story they want to tell, I think really comes through on Star Wars.
You will be not. There is no try.
I joke that the best thing about writing Princess Leia is everybody knows who she is, and the worst thing about writing Princess Leia is everyone knows who she is.
It doesn't look like they're even hungry when they get out. They're not just like, did you bring a Snickers or something?
I'm honored to be here. I'm also impressed that you got Zach Galifianakis as a guest tonight.
That's so funny.
I've always been kind of a closet Star Wars fan up until, maybe 15, 20 years ago.
I'm just sort of a fan hoping to bring other fans along. That's all I'm doing.
The galaxy isn't growing to push people out. It's growing to let more people come in and find their love so that it's able to continue and create this connective tissue that grows forever.
Where now I feel like I can't do that because somebody's going to turn it into a blog post and then it's going to become a whole thing.
I have had the best time ever on Around the Galaxy.
Coming back to a show that I dearly love and admire, so thanks for having me.
Grace, peace, and welcome to Podcast of the Wills, the podcast that treats Star Wars like a sacred text. I'm back. If you can tell, when we got rolling live, we have switched streaming platforms. We're trying something new out. So I hit the wrong video and it made another video run when I push go live. It's technology, and I'm just on that edge of I'm not too old to be here, but I'm also not young enough to be anywhere else. So technology, it's just a thing. I deal with it. It's so fun to be back. It's so fun to be recording new episodes. We spent a bunch of time getting ready for Potathon, which was back. Gosh, that was in September now. It's hard to believe that that's been almost 2 months ago. We took a break, and then we got back into the swing of things, recording new episodes of Podcast of the Wills, new episodes of ATG Cast, Around the Galaxy, all that fun stuff. So we're back tonight. We're going to record another episode. I know we were going to have some friends drop in and hang out with us probably in the live chat. So thank y'all for being here. Thank you for hanging out. I don't want to waste any more time because I have an exciting guest. And if you're a patron, is that what we call it? Patron. If you're a patron, again, see, bad at this. I just like to ask people questions and then get out of the way so they can talk. If you are a patron and you're hanging out tonight, you probably already know that my guest tonight is Tim Barnes. Tim is one of the hosts of the Yub Nub podcast, which I found because of my friend Greg Iwinski. Tim is also a bunch of the things that I wish I was, like a writer and a TV writer, and he's been in the improv circle. There's lots of cool stuff that he does, and I'm going to get him to tell us about it because I'm fascinated by it. But I'm excited to have Tim Barnes as a part of the podcast, so I'm going to get him in here, and we're going to start our fun conversation. So let's do it.
Hello. The sacred texts. I'm doing well. That's
right. The sacred text. That's what we do here.
Yeah. This is a fun show. I'm speechless. If people who are watching this live, you just have this awesome setup. I feel like I'm, talking to you in some genuine Star Wars technology.
We tried, if we do anything on this show, we try to make it look good. Whatever happens after that is just a whole other deal. So we can do graphics, we can do videos, we can do all that stuff. And my buddy Pete, puts most of that together for us. But beyond that, everything you see behind me, I'm literally in the corner of my garage. Everything in front of me does not look this cool. But I've managed to carve out a little studio in a house where I have a wife and 4 daughters. So this is what we do. We hang out. Beautiful. We talk about Star Wars.
I like to imagine that everyone in your house has a differently themed corner of the garage. So there could be a My Little Pony corner. There could be.
That's right. Yeah, it could be American Girls. Actually, I have
Yeah.
14-year-old twins right now, and they are currently obsessed with individually Guns N' Roses and Green Day. So, as a parent, I feel like I'm doing something a little bit right, but their
Nice.
corners have changed drastically from My Little Pony to, American Idiot and Use Your Illusion.
I'm going to stop you right there. I had to pause my brain for a second to realize you did not say you have 14-year-old children, because I was.
That's right. No, I have two 14-year-olds. That's
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Yeah, totally different thing.
Yeah.
That's why punctuation matters. That's the part of the deal. And as a writer, nobody knows that better than you. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing well. I just watched the latest episode of Andor yesterday. I had a double. I watched it twice. I find this is the rare Star Wars show that I actually make sure to watch twice in a day. That's how good it is. It's like a dense book each chapter of this series.
It's really interesting that you say that, and I want to dig into Andor a little bit as we get into some of the things I want to talk about tonight. But one of the conversations, and just a little peek for anybody who's listening to the audio version of this, you're going to have to go back and dig. But our episode of Streaming Star Wars tomorrow night, which is our live stream show we do on Fridays, where we talk about the latest, Star Wars show that's on, topic of the week, that kind of stuff. We're going to do a little middle segment where we're talking about normies, which is what we call people who are not as hardcore into Star Wars as we are. Normies versus nerds. And kind of the catchphrase that I put on that was, maybe I'm the problem. Like, maybe part of the reason we get so worked up about Star Wars is that the sweaty nerds like me spend too much time being worked up and all these kinds of things. But one of the guests we're going to have on is my co-host Pete, his 70-something-year-old dad who loves sci-fi, who loves Star Wars, but is not into it like we are. And he wrote a blog post, and he kind of said, the 8 reasons why, Andor may or may not be working. And one of the early things and bullet points in his post was, you have to watch it twice, and for a normal Star Wars fan, for a normie, you watch it and you're like, what happened?
Yeah.
We watch it because we want to catch the Easter eggs and all the other details. And as content creators, we kind of catch ourselves on defense watching it the first time. Like, what am I looking for? What am I looking for? The second time we get kind of soak it in. So I love hearing you say that even as, a Star Wars fan and as a writer, you're like, I've got to watch this thing twice. Like, it's that good. There's so much there.
Yeah, and I have to focus on the dialogue. I have to figure out the nuances, and that's what makes it great. I know that you love wine, not wine. I learned that you love whiskey, and
For sure.
Something I tweeted a couple weeks ago was like, what I love the most about Andor is that it feels like a show that you have to pour a glass of whiskey to watch, because it's just like, this is gritty, it's serious, it's talking about actual life. And it's actually expanding Star Wars in so many great ways. Like, I rewatched a couple episodes of the Obi-Wan Kenobi show, and Andor has helped me figure out in a more grounded way what is happening in the Star Wars universe during this time period, because this is about 5 years before Andor, right? Or about about 5 years before Andor. Yeah. So now I have a better sense of what's happening with the Galactic Senate. I have a better sense of so many things. I know that there are TV shows with news anchors in the Star Wars universe, like these little. I know that there's breakfast cereal.
I was going to say, you can be eating your space Cocoa Puffs while that space news anchor.
Yeah.
I just feel like if we put the word space in front of all of it, it qualifies it as, fitting the thing. So you've got space Cocoa Puffs, space news anchors, space, overbearing mothers, like all the different things that, that go into it. But it's fascinating. And I want to circle back to that because I want to get kind of your perspective as a TV writer for sure. And this just, again, how great this show is. And I've talked about you guys' show and the conversations y'all are having about it too. But let's start here. For anybody that doesn't know Tim, give us a little bit of background on who you are, some of the things you do, and then let's circle that and tie that into kind of your earliest connections with Star Wars, where you found it, how it has gotten and affected your life.
I'm a comedian and writer. I was born in a small town in African America. I was born in Los Angeles, California. And and I was a pretty sheltered kid. I grew up in South Central LA. I think now it's just called South LA because they found that South Central sounded too dangerous. And wasn't allowed to go outside much as a kid. Not that I really wanted to, because I really just loved television. I loved books. I love sci-fi. And Star Wars was really the thing that kind of catapulted me into that. Like when there would be those scholastic book fairs, I was just like, and I was a child of the prequels. Like I was so hyped for it. I got the hype for that movie, for the Phantom Menace, with all of the Pizza Hut cups and all of the random magazines and breakfast cereal covers. And so I remember like picking up this mysterious magazine, like a behind the scenes magazine about this new Star Wars movie that's coming out for an all new generation. And I remember flipping through it and seeing this like face of a tattooed figure that's red and black and being like, oh, who's this? Darth. And this was my thing. I called him Darth Maul because I was reading his name. And I have this very specific memory of like, huddling up with some of my other friends who were excited about it and be like, oh my God, I can't wait to see what this Darth Maul is all about. And my good friend be like, you idiots, it's Maul. It's like Paul with an M in front of so my first passion in life, like my first concept of what I wanted to do was to be a mad scientist, because I read the novelization of Flubber before the movie came out. And then as I got older and realized that math is too difficult, I realized that what got me into wanting to be a scientist was movies. And so that was my big goal, is to be a filmmaker. And as I got a little older, it was like, my favorite part of the day is just laughing with my friends while we're hanging out before school starts. And I was a tech in theater and that kind of thing. In 2012, I moved to Chicago with a good friend of mine from high school, Ian Abramson, and I dove into doing a lot of stand-up. And on top of that, still being kind of a behind-the-scenes guy, editing the podcasts and video and things like that. Ended up moving to New York, and so still that duality of being a behind the scenes person, but also someone who performs and does stand up and stuff. And basically realized that what I really want to do is how do I simplify all of these different things that I do? And it's just, I want to create things, and I want to tell stories, and I want to be in a room full of people making something that people enjoy. And so try to get these little stepping stones to move from being a behind the scenes guy to like on the technical end, to someone in these rooms, the rooms where it happens, right? That's the phrase. And so I, gradually got to the point where I was writing for television. This was a huge leap forward for me. And so doing different forms of sketch writing. I was writing digital sketches for Comedy Central. My first TV writing job was for the reboot of All That on Nickelodeon, which was very exciting, very fun. I got to meet Kel Mitchell and Lori Beth Denberg and all of these icons of the glory days of the 90s on Nickelodeon. And from there, I was a writer on The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon for a year and a half. All during the pandemic, all from my apartment in New York. Never met 90% of my coworkers, never met Jimmy Fallon in person. So it stays in my mind as a surreal sort of Twilight Zone experience, which I think is kind of the best. Like I left after that year and a half because I knew that we were going to be in person soon. I was like, you know what? I'd like to keep this weird. I like to just maintain the weird story and then leave. Because it's like,
keep the mystery going,
right? It's like, did this happen? Did I, did I write a game for Jimmy and Seth Rogen to play on Zoom called the Pickle Juice Challenge? It sounds made up, but it feels true at the same time.
That's right.
And
it becomes the whispers of the internet during the pandemic. Like, did this happen? Is it possible I can YouTube it, or is it? Just that's the movie Big Fish with Ewan McGregor from years ago. Like he told all these stories, and they may happen, they may not have happened. We don't know.
We don't know. We don't. It was I'm sure we've all experienced the depths of COVID pandemic lockdown fatigue.
Sure.
And so I left that, and I wrote for a new show on Nickelodeon. It was a live action sitcom called Warped, which is about these teenagers who work in a comic book store in San Diego and all of these shenanigans they get into in the mall. That was incredibly fun. Unfortunately, there wasn't a season 2, but we got to do a few things that were essentially these like great Star Wars parodies. there was an episode where the gang, they snuck onto the set of what is essentially The Mandalorian, but we gave it a different name, and then we got to. It was just it was like the closest thing I'll probably ever get to writing for an actual Star Wars project, because we just got to we kind of combined Mark Hamill and the Mandalorian into one figure basically in that episode.
Love that.
So since then, this year I released a 3-episode animated web series through Comedy Central called Maurice on Mars, which is about the first Martian colony, and this poor guy named Maurice, voiced by myself, who sneaks onto a shuttle to the first Martian colony, but the only job he can get is at a coffee shop, and he's the only person who doesn't get the mandatory fact inhibitor chip that keeps things utopic. So he's the only person who can see that this utopia is just recycling the same old Earth problems.
That's right.
And
it's not so great.
Not so great.
I have watched those, the ones that are available online, and it's very funny. Like I
Thank
really
you.
enjoyed that. Yeah, it's a lot of fun.
I had so much fun putting it together, and I got to, Lori Beth Denberg voices Maurice's robot boss, and I really, it was my first foray into animation and working with animators, and it's such an in-depth process every single step of the way. There's so many options, but you also have tight deadlines, and it gave me a little glimpse into what life might be like for someone like George Lucas. I mean, who's kind of gotten to the point where near the end of his time at Lucasfilm, where he was in control of his deadlines. And so when you have an infinite play set and and you're paying all of the checks, what do you do with such power? Does great power corrupt? Absolutely.
That's right. Or absolutely does it not? That's so fascinating. And we've seen, obviously with the sale of, Lucasfilm and Star Wars to Disney and the change that created. But like, honestly, what you're talking about, it always stands out to me. The conversation I think was probably had after the first season of Mandalorian, when they did those gallery episodes, which, for me, those behind the scenes gallery episodes of any of these shows, I'm almost as into those as I am the shows themselves, because I just love hearing how they did it, what the inspiration was. And early on, you get the conversation of Filoni and Favreau and talking about, our older brothers had all the good action figures. We had the leftover ones. We had like a beaten up Boba Fett and something else. And so we thought, let's make a show about that. Like you have the resources, and like you're talking about with animation, and, the pressure that comes with it, the deadlines and that kind of thing. But like, it's kind of wide open. Like, where do you want to go with it? What do you want to do with it? Like that, as a creative person and as somebody who's, striving to create things, there has to be some neat, fun power within that. Like, I really can kind of make it what I want it to be.
Yeah. Yeah. And how do you, I think what's important is just really forcing yourself to have clarity of vision. And a lot of creating, a lot of leading groups of other creators is about at least saying something definitive at every step of the way, even if later on you have to backtrack and say, hey, that definitive thing I said about what this character has to look like, I'm going to backtrack on that. But these things you did with that old direction were pretty good. Let's just try and focus on this for now on.
Sure.
Yeah, you learn a lot about leadership.
Well, and
as
as
something
something
you have to do as you grow up and become an adult.
That's right. One of those grown-up things that we heard so much about, and now it's here. Well, and it's certainly with something like Maurice on Mars, like it was your creation. It wasn't like you came in to work for somebody else and I'm just going to write on, Greg's project or so-and-so's. Like, this was your baby. This was your thing that, you conceived and put together. So it creates another level, not only of accountability, but of course the standards that you hold yourself to as well, certainly as a creative person. And where is that going to go? And is it going to be what you envisioned? I can't imagine, having that pressure, like what that feels like.
Yeah, I think this was truly because a lot of things I've worked on before have been collaborations with other people, like my friend Ian Abramson. We made a short a couple years ago that we co-wrote and co-starred in. But Maurice on Mars is truly the first solo project of mine, in that sense of like I was a sole writer, I was the person leading a lot of the decision making, and what I didn't realize would happen was that is what happens after it's released. I was like so psyched, a little bit nervous, but once it's released, it's out there, and you have no control over what
It's just out there.
It's just out there, and so it was. What was fascinating for me specifically with Maurice on Mars is that it was out there, and I think Comedy Central put some money into promoting it on YouTube, so it's popping up on people's screens who didn't type in anything that has to do with Mars, that kind of thing. And so the challenge is someone like myself who genuinely likes getting feedback on the things that I create, and trying to figure out how to do better the next time. I had this unique challenge of, unfortunately, I'm the person, I will admit, I read the comments and have to sift through like what is actual genuine feedback that, and what is the result of someone who thinks that my animated project is the woke media trying to do a watered down South Park on a
well, and that's such a good kind of transition, and not one to one, but a comparable thing to what we've seen in Star Wars, and what we've seen not only. I mean, obviously, when Star Wars kind of picked up steam with the sequel trilogy, when we get, when Force Awakens is happening and we move forward, of course, there's expectation. There's things that's going to come with that. But what I'd love to move into and talk about a little bit now is we say all the time we're in a golden era of Star Wars. We've got so many things that have come our way. But really, since Rise of Skywalker, which was, 2019? The golden era of Star Wars right now is all television.
Yeah.
Whether it's animated, whether it's series like Mandalorian, Book of Boba Fett, Andor, that kind of thing. And of course, if you spend any time on Twitter, if you spend any time, certainly in Star Wars fandom, but any fandom, it's not exclusive. You get it in Marvel, you get it in Lord of the Rings. We've seen that kind of stuff. I would love to hear some of your thoughts on, as a TV writer, and I've heard you guys talk about this on your show on Yub Nub, but talk about being a TV writer, seeing Star Wars kind of transition into being a TV property at this point. Like, we know at some point we're going to get movies. I don't think they're going to be done with it, but the core focus of Star Wars right now is TV, or streaming TV, which we call TV at this point. How does that hit for you? Certainly, I think it probably relates as a TV writer, and the possibility of like, ooh, could I get into that?
Yeah.
But it relates to what you're talking about, certainly with the criticisms. We get criticisms every week in Star Wars, the controversy of the week, what is the thing? Talk to us about some of that and where that hits for you.
Yeah, I mean, I love the TV era of Star Wars, and I think for me the biggest thing is that when it comes to movies, especially now, movies have to be so big that in a way they can't be specific. And the things that are going through the studio's mind is like, how's this going to do in China? How's this going to do in the South? How's this going to do?
Right.
And so me personally, I think about things like, I mean, clearly after The Force Awakens, which I happen to think in hindsight is my favorite of the sequel movies.
Okay.
The chemistry between Rey and Finn is so obvious and present in there, and to have them separated so much, I personally have to assume that there are meetings about race and and romance,
for sure,
and happening.
Absolutely,
that's kind of the only reason that's not there, it seems.
Right.
And so risk taking isn't allowed, and I think the Rise of Skywalker, which can only be helped with the TV shows. I hope that the TV shows explain so many things,
right,
that one day I will watch the Rise of Skywalker and it will all just
it'll all feel
flow.
better, right?
It'll all feel better. But the Rise of Skywalker, in a lot of ways, is the most extreme example of how somehow J.J. Abrams was not allowed to take a single risk in that movie.
Right.
C-3PO loses his memory. He gets it back. I think Chewbacca's dead for a second, and I'm watching that live in the theater. I turn to my friend and say, I'm conflicted. I don't know how to feel right now, which is a beautiful thing to feel in a movie theater. Right. And just as I'm saying that, I see that Chewbacca is alive. And not only do I see Chewbacca is alive, I see it before our main cast knows that Chewbacca is alive. So by the time I see them react to that, I don't even have no impact.
It's not a thing anymore.
Meanwhile, television is all about specificity, and it's all about these decisions. And you kind of need some sort of cliffhanger at the end of every single episode to keep people coming back, or you need, you're slowly telling a story, and you need these incentives step by step to keep people watching. And so I think that's what's exciting about television. I think that's why so many people are on board with it. And what's most amazing is just the variety of styles. To me, The Mandalorian feels like, I don't even know how to explain it, but when Hercules and Xena would come on, what day of the week did they come out on?
Yeah, that was like, gosh, what was that? Was that even that was like a Saturday evening thing?
I think so. Yeah, it feels like that. It feels like Saturday evening is the best time to watch The Mandalorian. Andor feels like prestige Friday night, 8 p.m. Everyone, should put it on. Ahsoka, looking forward to that. It seems like that's going to be perhaps a little more mystical, samurai specifically. It's just beautiful. It's beautiful to see. And it's like, this is Star Wars' chance to answer a number of questions. To like, what excites me the most about The Mandalorian is that as the seasons go by, it should explain the rise of the First Order, which is something that just from the movies, I do not have a good sense of how they showed up there.
And unless you played Fortnite and heard that one video or one audio message from Palpatine that was in Fortnite, we don't really know how this happened. So that's a really great way to look at that. And I love, even comparing it to the TV, landscape that we've been used to over the last, 20 years or so, 20, probably 30 years at this point. You had the Friday night TGIF, you had the Thursday night, I think about the Thursday night NBC block where you had 30 Rock and The Office and Parks and Rec and all these, that feels like that's where Book of Boba Fett fits, because it was a very wide swath kind of thing. It wasn't the first one, but it also wasn't maybe the primetime slot. It was the middle one.
Yeah.
Because Boba Fett appeals to a bunch of people and it had a different vibe. And I mean, Kenobi might have maybe even almost fit that West Wing vibe, Wednesday nights at 7 or 8.
And Kenobi had that full range. Kenobi had some of the most violent scenes I've ever seen in Star Wars, but at the same time would fluctuate to, the chasing Princess Leia, which I'm totally fine with, because I think that what that show is really doing, it's trying to fit some connective tissue between the level of campiness of the prequels in some regard and what we get in the original trilogy. And I think it does that seamlessly. I
think that's exactly right.
Yeah, if you can watch Jar Jar Binks get pod lasers numbing his tongue, you can handle Princess Leia having a bit of a goofy chase.
But by some aliens who also look like they're ready to be having their tongues lasered as well. It totally connects, and it totally fits with fitting the genres, which I think is really impressive. And just, I love plugging it into that way, because that's how we're programmed at this point as content consumers. We're used to the streaming platforms. We get into modes where we get Tales of the Jedi and we're going to get all 6 of them at one time. If you give it to me all at one time, I'm going to watch it all at one time. But I also get something like Andor or Mando, or, the weekly streaming thing where it became more of a deal. I'm excited. I'm especially pleased that Andor is as good as it is, and that I get it once a week, that like I want to savor it, and I also want the time, like we talked about earlier, to process it, to watch it more than once, to get the first viewing in, and then go back and go, what are we really saying here? Like giving it really has time to develop. And then we have other properties that go alongside that. If you're a House of the Dragons person, if you're a She-Hulk person, if you're a Lord of the Rings, like if you're a fan of fandoms and all these different things, like there's something every night of the week almost, which is a fun place to be also, because I don't have to be, well, crap, Andor's over, I've got to wait another week because I have this on Sunday, I have this on Tuesday, I have this on Thursday. Like that's a fun place to be too. But as a TV writer, and I want to dig into this a little bit, because Andor's another level. And again, I referenced Yub Nub. You guys, I think your episode this past week, when you guys kind of got into it, it's kind of the first big episode that y'all have done, because y'all were on a little bit of a break talking about the show. It's so good. Like just as a writer and as a TV writer, just talk to us about how good it is. Talk to us about, what you're seeing and where it resonates for you.
It's like I said in that episode of Yub Nub, I think people overuse the term masterclass, but it really is a masterclass, because what's beautiful is that it's telling a story that doesn't have to be Star Wars, but is elevated because it is Star Wars. And it does things that are just great reminders for any writer. Just like what I keep coming back to is just stakes within any situation, because it's so focused on conversations, but it manages to not make the conversations boring. And that's what makes me kind of angry when people say this show is boring. There are stakes within each of these conversations, and it's manipulating us as an audience, because sometimes we have more information than a few of the characters while we're watching the conversation. Sometimes the characters have more information than us while we're watching the conversation. And was it episode 7? After episode 7, Andor has already done the heist on Aldani, and he comes back to Ferrix, and he's having this conversation with Marva, and and he can't tell Marva that he was involved in the heist. He can't tell her
that he did it.
And yet the heist that he was a part of has genuinely inspired his mother in a way that she hasn't been inspired in years since the death of her husband.
It's unbelievable.
And she is mentioning this to Andor.
It's like Aunt May bragging about Spider-Man because of all the great things he's doing for their neighborhood, while Peter's standing there going, I can't tell you that's me. Like, it's that same vibe. And again, that's so multi-layered, and that's not something we're used to in Star Wars, which is sometimes why you see the complaints from the people online. Oh, it's too slow, it's too this. Like, it's really not. And like as we continue to watch it, and again, these are all my opinions, I'm just putting it out there, but like, we hear the pacing thing and we hear the deliberate thing. You can throw in all the cliches you want to. It's just good. Like, the tension builds right. The conversation. I mean, when Mon Mothma is having one of these fancy parties that her jerk of a husband has thrown again, where she's like, you're inviting all the people that hate me to come to our house. And then the teenage daughter shows up. And the teenage daughter is suspicious because the old boyfriend, who's also, Tay, the other guy, like, you're just on the edge going, the teenager's going to be the one that figures it out. The teenager's going to be the one that's spoiled. Like, it gets so real. It gets so connected. I mean, and the layers of it. You could go with Dedra. You can go with Vel and Cinta. You can go with Bix. There's not a character in this show that is wasted. And absolutely the way these stories interlock, and we're not even getting into freaking Stellar Skateboard or Stellan Skarsgård. If you watch How Did This Get Made, Stellar Skateboard. But Luthen and the Clea, the assistant that worked, like, every single one of these, it just, you hang on to it. Like, you can't not be gripped by it. And again, if it wasn't Star Wars, it'd still be an amazing story.
Yeah.
That people would tune into. I want to do an experiment, and I haven't done it yet. I really want to get my wife to watch it, and the challenge right now is to get her to suspend the Star Wars part of her brain that goes, but this is a Star Wars thing, because I really think she'd enjoy it if she can just disassociate that one part of it.
I do think that someone who has never seen Star Wars can dive into the show, unlike any other Star Wars property, because this is just a sci-fi thriller, and it explains things along the way. Like it's like the beginning of the show on the rainy planet, and he's looking for his sister, and he that is just such a great introduction to Andor. And it's such a great use of making a prequel essentially interesting, because you're not wondering, how is Andor going to get to the point where he meets this character from Rogue One?
Right.
You're thinking, how the heck is Andor going to get out of this specific situation?
How's he going to get out of the fact that he just killed 2 corporate security guards in the first 5 minutes of this show?
And the show keeps doing this. It's like, how is he going to get through this heist alive? How is he going to get out of this prison? How is he, you're just interested in these specific situations, and it's specifically intense situations that you, and your question is how would I get out of that if I were in that situation?
Right.
It's just brilliant.
It really is. And it's so, this is the other thing talking about, I mentioned earlier, and of course I talk about it every week. If it was a drinking game, people would be dead watching the show. But talking about being in a golden era of Star Wars, we have so many things, and my network co-partner, Pete, he talks all the time, the different windows and doors that we have at this point for people to come into Star Wars. Whether it's animation, whether it's live action, whether it's movies. I'm an original trilogy guy. Prequel trilogy people, my kids, their first real Star Wars things were like, oh, you want to go to the movies? They didn't care about what movie it was. They just want to go to the movie theater. And it was sequel trilogy movies. But the fact that we have so many entry points into this fandom that, I've loved for going on 44 years now is so diverse. And it's so, if you want the spy thriller, you need to watch Rogue One. You need to watch this show. If you want the Fast and Furious version of some sort of Star Wars, you watch Book of Boba Fett, because we've got shiny speeders, and we've got action scenes, and we've got a big, dinosaur monster rolling through the streets of the city and tearing stuff up. If you want kind of an Old West vibe, you get Mandalorian. If you want, it's all there. If you are an old guy like me and you just want to know more about Obi-Wan, you watch Kenobi. There's something there for everybody.
Yeah.
But even within that, and this is where I always come back to, within the wide-ranging availability of stuff, there are surprises. I'm not the right age or target demographic for Star Wars Rebels, but it's maybe one of my favorite things since the Disney acquisition. I love Rebels in a way, as an original trilogy kid and somebody who was born in 1978, it wasn't targeted at me. Clone Wars, the animated series, is not my jam. I appreciate it. I go back and use it kind of like a reference book to look up, arcs and things that I didn't know about. But because of Rebels and the love that I grew to have for Ahsoka out of Rebels, the last season of Clone Wars, season 7, that last bit of it, in the tank. Ahsoka versus Maul, all those things, I am there for that. I appreciate Bad Batch more than I would have. It's so neat, and it's just impressive to me. And this is one of the things that I have said for a long time about the Disney acquisition of Star Wars. For all the complaints, for all the things that people say about Disney, from its inception has been about telling stories. And that's what Disney does, is they tell stories really well. It may not be the story that you want or the story that I want, but it's a story that hits someone and connects somewhere. And to add that to Star Wars, to me, just improves what Star Wars can be. And of course, there are flaws and there are faults and there are real world life things that happen, decisions, changes, retcons, we've heard all those different things. And that's not to dismiss those. But I guess what I'm asking you, and this is a very long-winded way to get to another question for you.
Yeah.
What do you see as a writer in the Disney Star Wars era that kind of is a plus for Star Wars?
I think, first of all, I love the premise of this show, and specifically because I'm writing something right now that is um, about the connection of big media stories that people love, like Marvel and stuff, and religion, and what happens
Okay.
if they converge.
Mhm.
And what's genuinely interesting to me about Star Wars at this moment is that, for me personally, I grew up in Los Angeles. I grew up close to USC, the school that George Lucas
Mhm.
went to.
Yep.
I was an introverted, nerdy kid. I have sort of a monotone voice. So when I discovered who George Lucas was, he was my guy. Like he
Yep.
and like he is the embodiment of this fantasy of like, oh, there's some stuff I jotted down. I can turn it into something that people will love, and that people want to dive into and want to know more about the lore of. So you go from having a figurehead like that, where you think all the beautiful stream of Star Wars comes out of, then a company acquires it, and you don't know. And I think the Star Wars community has been fractured in a bit before that, but that kind of like cracked open the egg. And I think a lot of the panic was just not knowing who is this being filtered through. And what I love about Star Wars right now is that there's so many great shows, so many great books, so many great everything, is that I'm finally at a point with it where I barely think about the name Disney when it comes to a lot of the Star Wars stuff coming out. And a lot of that is because it's Star Wars has gone from a kingdom to a republic.
Yep.
And now I know more about the inner workings of this republic. And I love, thinking about Favloni, which is what we call the combination of Favreau and Dave Filoni. And I love knowing that Tony Gilroy has his sort of patch. And I love knowing that there's a Star Wars story group. And I love knowing that there is with the Old Republic books, like I love just this idea that like all the writers get together and have a couple weeks to talk about how they're going to map out this story. And that's the exciting part. That is like a living, there's a concept of the living force in Star Wars. It feels like there's a living force of writers and creators coming to an agreement on a thing, coming to an agreement on what happens to the Old Republic and how does it get us here, and kind of going to their own lanes and helping to make it all cohesive. It's actually like a very difficult thing to do. and they seem to be doing it, and it seems like there are some growing pains with the tight deadlines of the sequel trilogy, but I think it's great that they've gotten past that, and they've clearly, that sequel trilogy like immediately gave them all the money they spent to acquire Star Wars. So I'm glad that that's out of the way. And now
that's right.
Now we can,
and it's so interesting to look at, and you talked about this before, especially as something that like relates to certainly Rise of Skywalker, but even the sequel trilogy as a whole. Like we're getting continually these backstories that fill in. How did we get to these big rocks? I always talk about big rocks. You have the original trilogy, you have the prequels, you have the sequel trilogy. Like those are our big rocks in this overarching story. But all these other things that come in behind it, like Clone Wars, Rebels, every live action show we're getting right now. I have such high hopes for Ahsoka. Like truly, again, as somebody who wasn't the target audience for that character, she's one of my favorite Star Wars characters, period. Like I love that character. I love what they've done with her. But we get to fill in those gaps. And that's the other neat thing about this franchise and the ability to literally plug in. How much do you want? Do you want to read the comics and the books and watch the shows and watch the movies? If you do, like you've hit the quadfecta or whatever. If you're like me, I'm going to watch all the shows. I've watched all the movies. I read the books in the old EU, like when I was in high school and we were in that dark time that we all talked about as old people, like, the original Thrawn trilogy is still one of my favorite Star Wars things ever. I've not done a good job of keeping up with the newer in-canon books when that all changed. I haven't read any High Republic stuff. I know it's great. I know people love it. I just haven't gotten there because I don't have the time. I don't have the, I get to the end of my day and I go, I can't read tonight. I have to go to, something easier like watching TV on my phone and falling asleep. But it's all there. And that's the beauty of the era that we're in. If you just want to watch shorts, you can do the Galaxies of Adventure shorts on YouTube. You can do Tales of the Jedi. You can do Visions, which is phenomenal. Like, there's literally something there for everybody. And I love that that's where we are with Star Wars, because that's what it feels like George Lucas wanted in the early days. I just want to make something that makes people happy. And I think that for the most part, that's where Star Wars is. Now, the parts of Star Wars that I hear about on a weekly basis, because I'm on Star Wars Twitter and all that stuff, you wouldn't think that's the case. But what I have to remember is I'm the smallest part of that bell curve. I'm the smallest part of somebody who sees a new episode and goes, "Ugh, this thing made me mad." And I can't believe that in, Luthen shop, Jar Jar's, shield generator is in the background. Like, somebody's going to have a thing to complain about, but ultimately that's not where Star Wars is. And that's why it's so fun to know it's just there to be enjoyed.
Yeah, for me lately, I've been kind of psychologically saying, just trying to remind myself what fandom felt like before the internet was where it is now. And it was, maybe this is a sign of me growing older as a person. I think everyone kind of gets to that point in their life where it's like, I'm just going to have a cutoff point in terms of like the way that I experience my fandom. But the internet element of it is not even that fun for the most part. It's not.
That's right.
And I think, we're in a time where there's like a lack of like physical spaces and like interactions with people in physical spaces. But so much of the fun of Star Wars is like that rare feeling of like back when there used to be video stores. You go to the video store and you're having a conversation with the clerk about Star Wars, or
Well, and that's such a great point, because you mentioned early, the pandemic and the things, the way, whether it was your job, whether it was, for me, this podcast has been in existence since 2017. And we did episodes sporadically when we could, meet up and coordinate living in two different towns and record something over, Skype or whatever it was we were doing. But when the pandemic hit, and purely by coincidence, I was out of work 2 weeks before the pandemic started. It was just one of those things that happened. So I had a year where I was home with my family, which I was glad for, because I helped my kids with virtual school and all the lockdown things. But that was the point when this show kind of took off and went in a different direction. And we went, weekly live streams, and I connected with people in this same, like you said, the internet realm. So it's the double-edged sword. I have made so many amazing friends, network partners, the people that I got to meet at Celebration, including our mutual friend Greg. Like, those things happened. And for all the crap that Twitter is and that Star Wars Twitter is, and for all those things, to go to Star Wars Celebration, it felt like a family reunion. I got to meet all these people that I've been friends with for a year now in real life, and hug their necks and have a drink at the bar in the back porch of the Hilton, and, do those things. But the people that went to Celebration, none of them were mad about Star Wars. They were there because they're like, holy crap, I love this. And like, that's those moments where you go, this is really what it's about. Like, it's about something that we want to enjoy and that we can have fun with. And to see it not only from the fan side, but from the creator side, and from the actors and the talent and the people going to those panels and listening to them talk. I mean, the big focus, of course, at Celebration was Obi-Wan, and Ewan McGregor and Hayden are there, and they're going, we came back to this because we realized the fans wanted it, and we realized the love and the outpouring. Like, that's the power of Star Wars, is in the people going, this is fun and I like it.
Yeah, and there is a way to make fun of Star Wars out of love as well. I don't want to.
Oh, for sure.
I don't want to.
I'm right there with you,
and that's part of the joy as well. Like, it's like
it reminds me. Absolutely, and it reminds me of, we did our Potathon charity event a couple months ago, and one of our good friends, the guys at the Bombad Cast, they had Seth Green on, and Seth Green talked about making Robot Chicken and making the Robot Chicken Star Wars stuff, and he was like, we're making fun of it, but we made fun of it because we love Star Wars, and George was on board for it because he got it. Like that's that fine like overlap of like, this is what it's supposed to be, is it's fun. There's funny I mean, Go for Papa Palpatine is never not funny when it's that, robot chicken Palpatine taking the phone call from Vader. Like it has a spot for everybody. And that's what I love so much about where we have ended up, and we just have to work our way through the less enjoyable parts. And that's where I remind myself that every day that passes, I become more Danny Glover and Lethal Weapon, and I'm just too old for this shit. Like that's where it ends up for, the grouchy parts of, social media and Star Wars.
Yeah, and I think I always imagine that all of this has to be absurd to George Lucas himself to a certain extent, but also strange because George Lucas is a guy who can wander through an office and be like, "Well, they're called droidicas," and like, what is what kind of life is that? Just
But somebody else is writing it down, going, "This is now a thing." Like,
And
it ends up in an archive. It ends up in a Art of book by Phil Shostak. Like somewhere along the line, it becomes a thing because George wandered through and went, "Hey, what about this? Why not?"
Yeah, why can't they just be called droidicas? The idea of like being too old for it is I'm amazed because I grew up with the prequels. I loved them, and then I kind of grew out of them, and I still kind of grapple with the meaning of that initial, like, I used to think the Phantom Menace was perfect, but now it's also surreal seeing just like there's a faction of Star Wars fans who are just like, who have stayed in that the prequels are perfect lane, and that's surprising. And so everyone has these places that they're at, and Star Wars is speaking of empires, is sort of an empire because it has steadily captured the imagination of 3 or 4 generations of children at this point,
right?
By doing the sort of like the Disney Vault thing, essentially. Like, it goes away for a bit, then it comes back right when you suddenly have kids. You watch it when you had kids. Now now those kids are old enough to watch a whole new version of it.
And then they give you Disney Plus, and you're like, what do you mean? I can literally have almost every Star Wars thing that ever existed at my fingertips, literally anytime I want to, on my computer, my TV, my telephone. Like, if you had told me that in 1989 when I was 11 years old, I'd have been like, I don't know what you're saying to me right now. Like, it doesn't make sense. It's so good. And that's why, it's a tough place to be, to say we should just enjoy it. We should just be thankful. We should just whatever, because there are real world stories being told. Andor shows us that. Like, there's something I want to shout out. Mesa Windu, on Twitter, he put a post up tonight. It is Thursday, November the 3rd. He put a post up, and it was like 8 or 12 like screenshots of different things from Andor, and it's all the real world 1-to-1 comparisons of like, police profiling and political things and indigenous people being erased and like all these things. That's real because that's the world we live in. And there's other things that are going to happen, and there are story changes that are going to happen that are going to affect groups of, minorities and people that are important. We've heard some stuff about Tales of the Jedi and, the end of that series and the Ahsoka story that got changed a little bit. Those are real things. And those are also, it's that moment to remember that, like, these are corporations, these are human beings that are making these stories, and there are going to be mistakes that are made along the way. But at the bottom of it, when we drill it down to the key base of it all, is it's a story that brings people together. It's a story that brings people like you and me who don't know each other, Greg, my buddy Pete, who lives in New Jersey, my friend Scotty, who lives in New Orleans. Like, these stories that spoke to each of us individually at the same time bring people together and bring us together to relate and connect around shared stories on different levels, which is still very powerful, while not excusing the changes and the problematic and ugly parts of it. we have that in real life. We have family stories that are ugly and difficult, and we have to work through those and figure out what is our role and how do we do. And I think what is dictated the most in that is how do we respond to those stories? And that's still a growing edge. That's something that's still being leaned into.
Yeah. And I mean, all great stories have plot holes and and things that don't necessarily. Almost every religion basically has that, and I think that
without a doubt.
And I think that everyone has their own sense of canon, and that's the fact that Star Wars is juggling this is also interesting. I mean, I'm not super like I like Marvel comics, but I wouldn't say like I'm like a very efficient nerd. But there are probably versions of this with like the actual comic book community and DC and Marvel where it's like, well, this contradicts this thing, and like those stories go on for since the like 40s, some like some of them, and the fact that they're somehow still a connected story with these characters that kind of don't age or they get replaced, like there's a new Robin or something. It's it's a web that is hard to take in at once.
For sure. I'm of that I only knew Robin as Dick Grayson.
Yeah.
But then all of a sudden, at some point, I'm like, wait, there's a Jason Todd? Who is Jason Todd? Jason Todd is also Robin? Like, the time I realized that, probably in like the late 90s or whenever that happened, I was like, wait, different Robin? What do you mean? And the difference is, I didn't like burn a couch in my front yard because it made me so mad that Robin was different. I just went, oh, okay. Like, I get it. Like, things happen, things change. Nightwing becomes it's the thing. But you're right. It's a change. It's about reception. It's about, how do we process those things as a fandom, which our humanity is going to bleed into our fandoms. And I think that maybe is one of the things that I sometimes try to realize, and sometimes you can't excuse it because horrible people are horrible people. But there are other times when somebody's screaming on the internet about something that made them mad in Andor or Obi-Wan or Book of Boba Fett, and you just have to stop yourself and go, their real life is not great. And that's why this is the thing that makes them mad, because there's 12 other things that are weighing on them, and this is their outlet. And that doesn't excuse it.
Yeah.
But it gives you that chance to also go, the internet's not real life. Real life is when you go to Star Wars Celebration and you meet the people that you've known online and they're everything you expected them to be. And you meet all the other fans that are there going, Star Wars is awesome. Let's go. Happy Saturday. Like, that's the deal.
Yeah. It's because I think like fandoms, like a part of what gets people into them is the world is so chaotic that it doesn't seem to make sense. There's no order to it. So then you get something like, let's say, Lord of the Rings, where it's like, this is a universe that someone's created, and I can dive into this, and it makes more sense than real life. It seems like that's what gets you into it, and I think that's also where the birth of a lot of frustration comes up, because once things start to get askew or don't connect as much, then like there's a heightened issue there for some people. But it's interesting to me that with the Disney acquisition meant something that genuinely I can understand why it came across as a betrayal, that whole thing of like severing the old expanded stories. That, where was it at that point? Were those considered canon? This is my favorite thing about it, because it's like, this is where it sounds like they're talking about actual religion at this point.
You ask somebody. For me, it was because like that original Thrawn trilogy, like I read it in the 90s when I was in junior high and high school.
And it's probably presented to you as canon at the time.
It was all that was available. So that I had no other possibility other than to accept, like, this is what Star Wars is. Like, to go back now, like I've listened to, podcasts where you've got Kevin Anderson and some of these folks that wrote these stories. And they're like, it was kind of like the Wild West. Like, we were trying to coordinate with each other, but also Lucasfilm was like, just write some stuff, like, go for it. Like, it was, it was all out there. But for me as the consumer, as a 13, 14, 15-year-old, whatever I was at the time, like that was the only Star Wars that was available, because the last thing I had gotten was Return of the Jedi in 1983. So I was like, holy crap, here's Star Wars, and it's a book, and I like to read. And thanks to the Pizza Hut Book It program, where I could read books and get free personal pan pizzas, like I'm reading every book I can get my hands on.
Yeah.
And so that was my Star Wars, and that was my canon, to come back to your point. It wasn't honestly until the Disney acquisition that canon versus legends was even a consideration.
Yeah.
Because it changed at that point, like, oh wait, this could be different. And I got why it did.
Yeah.
But it was still a new concept.
And it feels like a schism. And you go to Wikipedia and you can see the schism. You got the Legends tab and you have the canon
It's
tab.
Literally listed as two separate tabs.
And I think there has been some atonement to that, because then it's like they're picking up elements of the Legends and they're giving it a new context in canon. And so this is the sweet spot. Like the thing I'm saying, I'm kind of writing right now is like in that sweet spot. This is what I'm obsessed with. Is like, what is that? And and what does it mean that so many people have been convinced of this thing? But then at the same time, the ability to pick up an element of the legend story and put it into a new context is kind of going back to that concept of a living force. I think like religion has this, there's a living element to all elements of society that are exemplified in that's what's happening with Star Wars right now.
100%. And it to bring it back to that very specific, and certainly it relates, to this show on a certain level, as somebody who grew up with a Christian background, I was, grew up at the Christian church, worked in the Christian church as a youth minister for 20 years. I'm an Episcopalian. I believe, I have a Christian faith of my own personal nature. I don't apply it to other people. My faith is my faith. But when you hear that conversation about, the living God is the living force. Like there's a one-to-one connection where you look at those things and go, this is how it relates.
Yeah.
When you talk about scripture, you look at the Old Testament and they're talking about slavery and women can't do it. Like that doesn't relate to real life, because that's not real life. That's not the world we live in now. But you can look at the changes and the inspiration, and you can find the things in that go, oh, this is the part that is actually helpful. The slavery part, not so much. We don't do that. That's not our deal.
And I just love it, because like I dove into Star Wars at such a young age that like I'm constantly, I can't help it, like I get sucked into Star Wars YouTube rabbit holes all the time. But everything in a way, like you have to find your own personal connection to anything. But I just love these, you have the two tabs of legends and canon. You can apply that to, Christianity and Judaism and Islam. You click on the Islam tab, they say like, well, Jesus wasn't the son of God, but he was a prophet. But we still have him in here. You can
Guess what? Jesus wasn't the guy with blonde hair and blue eyes that shows up in most of the Southern Baptist churches in the part of the country I live in. That's not what Jesus looked like if he was a real person. He was a Middle Eastern dude. His skin was brown. His hair was dark. Like that's what it does.
Yeah.
But that's exactly it. And the inspiration that's drawn from it. And for me, I always go back to the very nature of faith is it's the single most personal thing that somebody can encounter. Mine is not going to be like yours because we're different people and our experiences are different. Our backgrounds are different. Where we came from is different. Every aspect of what my faith is going to differ from yours, from my wife's, from my best friends, from, my priest, from whoever it is that I connect with. That's what faith is. It's intensely personal. And if it's real, it's the most personal thing you have. And so to look at Star Wars in a similar lens, I'm going to receive Star Wars differently than Tim is, because I come from a different background. I come from a different socioeconomic status. I come from a different ethnic status. Every part of Star Wars is going to speak to me differently than it's going to speak to you or to one of my 14-year-old daughters or to one of, my almost 70-year-old father who received it differently than I did. Like, it's the power of story, and that's what's the most, faith is story when we boil it down. So to get to that level and to figure out where does it connect, where do we find ourselves in that story, that's the power of the whole thing. Whether it's Joseph Campbell, whether it's George Lucas, it's all right there.
Yeah. And the strange beauty of Star Wars is that it has a spiritual code, in a sense, that is so vague, beautifully vague, that people of all walks of life can attach to it and find something from
Absolutely.
it. And that is that that is just something. I don't even know what I have to say, but that is just that's something.
You're exactly right.
Yeah.
Well, I want to hit a couple of quick other questions because I love this conversation. I love where we've been. I want to ask you a couple of things before we get out of here. As a TV writer, and I don't want to paint you completely into a box because you may have a feature film in your pocket. I don't know. But I know certainly a lot of what you have done in your career has related to TV writing. If you, Tim, could write a Star Wars TV story, anything that you could pick, and this, I'm putting you on the spot because I didn't ask you this question ahead of time. If you could write a Star Wars story to go on Disney Plus, to be a series, to be a something, what would be the story that you would want to write?
Okay. I have two answers. The one that it seems like they, I forget the name of a lot of the new Star Wars shows coming out, that they may be doing something that's sort of like tailored for children and kind of scary, right?
Skeleton Crew,
which seems great. But I used to read these books called Galaxy of Fear. Have you heard of them?
Yep.
These were,
I know what you're talking about. Yep.
I would love to make a Galaxy of Fear series. Lately, when I've been watching Andor, I'm in love with Ferrix, and there's something about episode 8 when Bix and I forget Andor's other friend, they're visiting Marva, and and
Tim. No, Tim's the boyfriend.
Tim died. I forget that character's name.
Brasso.
Yeah. And you got B in there. And I would love to make a Norman Lear style sitcom set on Ferrix about working class life in Star Wars.
It's so weird that you say that because this is not a conversation. This is not a conversation I've literally had with anyone. Pete, who I text on a multiple times a day to basis, my network partner, anybody else. There have been multiple times watching this show, the Marva stuff with B and Marva in that apartment, not turning on the heat, Brasso, the neighbors, like Norman Lear is literally the thing that's popped in my head. So the fact that you say that, I'm like, there is a space there for that kind of thing.
Or at least a Roseanne, you got the spinning camera around a table at Marva's house and then a huge Roseanne style cackle at the end. I'd watch that.
Yeah, it's I would be there. It'd be a completely like, that's the thing I want to see. Like, that's a way to go. So Norman Lear Star Wars, let's make that happen.
Let's do it.
Written by Tim.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. Well, what I want to do now, and as we get close to wrapping up, I ask this question of all of my guests. And as we say, Podcast of the Wheels is the podcast that treats Star Wars like a sacred text. Even if somebody doesn't have a personal faith background, we get that idea of, a spiritual experience, a moment where something hits us on a deeper level than just a movie, just a TV show. So for you, Tim, can you put your finger on a Star Wars spiritual experience you've had, which is essentially a moment where for you, Star Wars hits you on a deeper level?
Yes, I would say that I actually have had a spiritual experience with Star Wars, and I can be a cynical guy. I'm a comedian. I grew up religious, and I take a lot of good stuff out of that experience, like just a general sense of purpose and a vague sense of faith that everything will be all right. But so the first time I watched The Rise of Skywalker, the moment with which was like, Rise of Skywalker came out a few months after the passing of Carrie Fisher. But I'm watching the scene where she, the ship explodes, she flies out into space, and then she kind of soars back in like Mary Poppins.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't necessarily, I kind of laughed at it, but I kind of didn't know how to feel about it.
Right.
Then you fast forward to I finally get a chance to watch that with my dad, and something about his experience watching that moment, there was a sense of genuine awe and wonder and something that felt connected to faith with him. And now when I watch that scene, I don't laugh at it as much.
Sure.
And I also kind of knew that this was probably connected to something, because I remember when I was a kid, my dad was telling me about a nightmare he had where he was falling down a cliff, and then as he was falling, he started to pray, and as he was praying, he started lifting back up on the cliff. And so that moment with Princess Leia felt connected to that sort of thing.
Wow.
Yeah. So
that's fantastic. That's really amazing. And that's one of those ones. And I love that that's a moment that you picked, because that's that scene. Like, we joke, we call it Space Mary Poppins, any of us that, kind of hung out in that fan, like what's going on here? But at the same time, like, I felt exactly like you did. Like, when it happened, I was like, wait, what? Like, I was thrown off, but I wasn't turned off. Like, there was that weird middle in between of like, but this kind of makes sense. And then for me, not having the same personal connection that you did, afterwards, I'm like, oh yeah, that happened in Rebels. Like, Kanan did that. And like, it was a Force thing that was available, and there was this other thing. But then also for me, and I know that my listeners have heard me talk about this a million times, I went to Celebration in 2017 in Orlando. And it was right after Carrie died in December of 2016. And Billie Lourd came out on stage, and she did the monologue that Carrie does in New Hope, General Kenobi, years ago, you served my father in the Clone War. And she's this woman standing on the stage doing this monologue that's iconic for her mom months after her mother has died. Like, that shrunk me down to like this big. Like, I was tiny, because I went, this is a truly humbling human moment that for me is the same as that spiritual moment, and being able to have that thing. So I love that yours relates to Leia. I love that it relates to a parental, family connection moment. That's very, very special. And I thank you for sharing that, because that's what it is. And that's when I asked that question, like, that's what I love to drill down into. Yes, it's movies, and yes, it's TV shows, and yes, it's stuff I'm going to complain about on the internet, because that's what we do now. But when we boil it down, it's fathers and sons, it's brothers and sisters, it's mothers and fathers, it's whatever it is, where we see ourselves reflected in this thing that we love so much.
Yeah, and I feel like as these new Star Wars properties come, Princess Leia or General Leia is sort of like the actual heart of Star Wars in this odd way.
Without a doubt.
And it comes from this, like, what I feel was a last minute decision to make her Luke's sister. But out of that, out of the sort of necessary recontextualization that you have to do as a franchise, has come a lot of beauty in there. And so now when you watch a show like Obi-Wan, she is she's a daughter to her adoptive parents. And the scene where Bail has to basically say to Obi-Wan, she's just as important as Luke. That hit hard for, like, I actually felt like a surge of something like pride in that moment.
It definitely paid off. It's fantastic. Tim, this has been an amazing conversation. I've had so much fun talking to you and hearing about, your connections, the way it, relates certainly to your career. Before we get out of here, I want to give you a chance to tell people where they can find you, what you're working on, promote anything, whatever you've got going on. Let everybody know.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter. Let's see how long that lasts after whatever's going on with Twitter at Tim Barnes 451. That's the temperature at which jokes burn. You can also get all kinds of information from me at timbarnescomedy.com, where I have a link to my to a newsletter called Letters from African America, where you'll be able to get all kinds of updates from me. I think I'm going to become a Substack newsletter guy. It seems like the next step to take in the world of the internet. Yeah, you can find on timbarnescomedy.com, you can find links to my cartoon, Maurice on Mars. You can find links to the Yub Nub podcast that I co-host. And I've got some exciting stuff coming up in the near future. So I can't really dive into right now, but believe me, 2023 is going to be my year.
Yeah, everything's coming up, Barnes.
Yeah.
I love it. Well, thank you so much for being with us. This has been a great conversation. I appreciate you. I love the show that you guys do. I cannot encourage any of our listeners enough to go check out Yub Nub Pod. Great conversations, TV writers talking about TV shows and talking about Star Wars. There's so much there that's totally worth you checking out. So do that. And until we are together again next time, may the Force be with you always.
Just one more round, friend, then homeward bound, friend. Don't forget me in your dreams. Just one more song, friend, and then so long, friend. The nights get shorter, it seems. Just one more rhyme, friend. Yes, it's a crime, friend. But you know time, friend. Time can fly. So it's good night, friend. Good night, but not goodbye.